Today's mystery involves this Stihl blower model BG56C. The initial complaint is that it just won't start, but then there is also an issue where the pull start locks up so violently that it jerks the blower out of your hand. I used this compression test kit, and although use of this kit is outside the scope of this video, I compared the compression against my own Stihl model BG56C, which is fully functional, and the blower that won't actually start had more compression, so lack of compression is not the issue. Next, I tested the coil by using this nifty inline spark tester, for which I will post a link. Let me show you how this works. Remove the spark plug wire and replace it with the wire from the tester like this. Then take the tester probe and place it inside the spark plug wire you removed. This device frees up your hands so that you can pull the starter cord and hold the blower down at the same time. We're looking for a light to appear when we pull the starter cord, like this. So we now know the coil is good. Using a spark plug wrench, I removed and examined the plug. It looks good, but watch this. The blower spit a ton of gasoline at me through the spark plug hole. That's another clue. Next, I'm examining the air filter by removing the cover. Remove the vent by grasping and pulling out and up. Take note of the orientation. I'm not too concerned about the condition of this air filter. I know the owner has never replaced it, so I ordered a new one. Let's remove the pull start flywheel cover and we'll examine the pull starter. The mystery continues. The pawls are in good shape and everything here is in working order. It's a good idea to keep the cover bolts with the cover. Next, I remove the muffler's two bolts to see if it has a clogged spark arrestor screen, but check out what I found instead. The muffler was completely full of gasoline. So we have a muffler and a piston cylinder full of gasoline to the point where it spits at me when the spark plug is removed. This explains the lockup while trying to pull start the cord because there's nowhere else for the gasoline or exhaust to go. Conclusion: the carburetor is malfunctioning and needs to be replaced. This kit I ordered off eBay contained everything I needed with a couple of exceptions. Let me show you. This was the carburetor that eBay matched to my blower model, along with gaskets, 2 new primer bulbs, fuel line, spark plug, and a fuel filter. Let's begin the carb replacement by removing these 2 nuts that hold on the air filter housing. Here I keep the nuts with the housing. If you haven't already done so, remove the spark plug wire. I separated the handle halves to get to the carburetor linkage by taking out these 3 Torx bolts. Note what I'm doing next. I hold the trigger in place as I remove the handle halves. This keeps the parts from flying across the yard before I see how they go back in place. I slide the trigger off the trigger pin and then remove the pin, and note how it slides through the trigger. The bottom of the trigger has a hole through which the flat end of the carb linkage passes, like this. Now this wire is a mystery to me, so I'll ask the viewers to chime in as to what purpose an electrical terminal has being attached to a plastic handle. Again, I store the bolts with the parts from which they originated. The carburetor is now loose, save for the 2 fuel lines and the linkage shown here. Don't fret that I don't yet show a close-up of the linkage location. That will come later. The carburetor is slid off the threaded cylinder rods. One fuel line is for fuel drawn from the tank by the primer bulb and sent to the carburetor. The other line drains unused gasoline back into the tank. I removed the first fuel line just fine using a screwdriver. Then for some reason, switched to a pair of needle-nosed pliers. Big mistake. I actually caught this tear later while editing the video close-ups and had to go back and replace the fuel line. It's always a good idea to compare new parts against the old. Here I orient the carbs in the same manner and compare. Right off I can see the adjustment screw locks are not on the new carb, but that's not a deal breaker. Side 2 looks identical, as does side 3. But here at side 4 is an additional primer bulb vent we will have to deal with. Another issue that crops up is the fact that the spark plug in the kit is too big. I ended up having to clean up the old plug, which fortunately was in good shape, and reinstall it. Let's go ahead and replace the fuel filter inside the tank. This was no easy task as I had to use my really long needle nose pliers and pull the old filter out butt end first. It would not come out any other way. The fuel line inside the tank was barely long enough to pull the filter out, so I used these spring-loaded grabbers to hold the fuel line in place while I swapped the filter for the new one using my screwdriver and not my pliers this time. To help me hold these identical gaskets in place during carburetor assembly, I used some Loctite 518, not as a sealer, but as a temporary adhesive. I placed a few drops on each gasket and used my finger to spread it around the perimeter. Line up and press these gaskets in place on either side of the carburetor, adhesive side down. Align the carburetor so that the round black choke knob is on the same side as the flywheel and attach the inside fuel line like this. And then the outside fuel line to the primer bulb like this. Align the carburetor holes with the long threaded rods from the cylinder head and press the carburetor into place. Now comes the time where I have to deal with that extra vent from the primer bulb. As you can see, the air filter housing cannot go back on as is. However, there is a small detent molded right into the housing that makes me think it may have been designed for this purpose. But how do I align it with the new vent so that I can drill a hole in the housing in the perfect spot? Let's use the old lipstick trick. Instead of lipstick, I use the Loctite again to place a film around the front edge of the vent. I will clean this off after this step. The air filter housing is then held in place, and I let the back of the housing touch the vent, which is coated with Loctite. Once the housing is turned over, I can easily see the mark where I need to drill the clearance hole. A 1/4 inch drill bit is compared against the outer circumference of the vent and seems to match pretty closely. If you have them, I'd recommend using brad point bits. The drill bit is slowly engaged with barely any pressure. Once through, I turn over the housing and remove this orange air funnel to gain access for my screwdriver to be able to clean up the plastic burrs. The directional air funnel is replaced. Now the housing fits perfectly. However, I was concerned about any air leakage around the newly drilled hole around the vent. So I installed this O-ring from an assortment I had in my shop, and it worked perfectly. The area inside the housing was so tight I couldn't use my fingers to thread the nuts, but my needle nose pliers did the trick. Tighten with an 8mm socket. I performed one last check of the O-ring seal. This was the new air filter I ordered, for which I will supply a link. The black filter material gets installed facing outward. If you recall, the vent gets oriented and reassembled like this. Now it's time for that close-up carburetor linkage shot I promised you. Here is the linkage receptacle. Using the hooked end of the linkage, loop it into place from the inside out like this. Lay the linkage down and hold it in place while attaching the trigger to the flat end. Pivot the trigger backwards and hold it into place while inserting the trigger pin. Allow the pin to travel through the electrical connection from the kill switch and into the hole in the handle. Test the linkage before sealing it up. If all looks good, attach the other half of the handle using the 3 Torx bolts. Again, test the trigger linkage. The pull start flywheel cover is now reattached. After the first of the 3 bolts is tightened, test the pull start for proper seating. Attach the other 2 bolts. Reattach the spark plug wire. Next, the air filter cover is placed back into position and tightened as shown. Here, I'm making sure the trigger lock works with the choke mechanism. With the choke engaged, the trigger should be able to be locked. When the locked trigger is pulled, it should disengage the choke knob. Looks good. Let's fuel her up and try it out.